Well, hello, Langdon. Just before the 15th May in Spain, I know that you were here studying the situation of doing certain studies where you met plenty of people here in Madrid, and then you went back to the United States when this happened. Now, what did you see in Madrid?
Well, when I went back to the United States, I just talked about meeting people from Media Lab Prado, philosophers at Complutense who were interested in notions of open source, free software, the commons, ideas like that. I talked to some journalists. I talked to some activists, particularly the hacktivistas at Tabacalera and Patio de Maravillas. I went back to the United States, and this was late 2010, early 2011, and just began giving talks about what I had seen there and all of the interesting things that seemed to be a kind of almost like a volcano before it blows. And so I talked to student audiences and my faculty about this, and I said, watch Spain, something is happening there. And then Tahrir Square came along, where you saw the plaza fill up, the relationship between people's face-to-face politics there, and the offline activities such as Facebook links and Twitter and so forth. And in that case, what you saw in early 2011 was dictatorships beginning to crumble and so forth. And in these talks that I gave, I said, well, who knows if this is going to spread or not. Most of the people that listened to this found it entertaining, but they maybe always find me a little crazy and entertaining. So they said, that's very nice, Langdon, but don't worry. And particularly in the United States, they would say, it can't happen here. People are so apathetic. They just watch TV, and that's that. Then when the May 15th event started happening, colleagues came up to me and said, oh, I think we understand some of the chemistry that's going on, how those various forces could bring tens of thousands of people into the plazas in Spain.
So now you are assisting to what's happening also in the United States,
Yes.
Occupy Wall Street.
Yes.
Do you figure to be some differences, or do they happen to be any difference or any similarities between what's happening in Spain and what's happening in the United States?
Well, I think they're both similarities and differences. I think some of the similarities are sociological and economic. You have major evictions of people from their homes, foreclosures, millions of people in the United States. You have unemployment rates that are at least 15 million people, but maybe as high as 25 million people unemployed who would like to have jobs. A huge economic problem in the United States. You also have increasing evidence, which mainly intellectuals and social scientists have known about for a long time, about increasing inequality of wealth and income. And these are, I think, problems that are very much shared with people in Spain right now. So this is the kind of sociological basis of all of this.
Well, you have very long time already being studying the relationships between technology and power and law and people. And in the articles that I have read from you and the books that I have read, you always happen to, there's some kind of structure that's system-centric, system-centered technology and man-centered technology, you know. So how is people dealing with technology in these places right now?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at electronic technologies, if you go back into the history of the development of these and their relationship to freedom and politics, you had the radio and the television, and what happened was in the early days of the emergence of these media, there was great hope that it could foster citizen involvement, democratic participation. And in both cases, what happened was, at least in the United States, you saw the concentration of power in the hands of the corporations, and people were excluded from these media. And of course, what we see today, I think both in the United States and in Spain and elsewhere, is the creation of digital networks, digital electronics, which enable people to communicate, very often just for consumeristic purposes. But now there's a tremendous potential, which I think in the last year we've seen kind of explode, like that volcano I was talking about, as people find ways to use these means to link with each other, to engage in conversations, even in places where this is forbidden, as in Egypt, for example. There was no civil society as such, but people found a way to link together through the networks. And what I think the most important thing that has happened, which never happened with radio and television, is that a vital link of people's involvement in the online world has now blended with the world of face-to-face publics in Tahrir Square, in Puerta del Sol, in Liberty Square, in near Wall Street in the United States, where you kind of have this interesting synergy now between what people are doing on the net and what they're able to do on the street. And I think that's what's really happened, and it's producing, very interesting and explosive dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you also spoke about that if we examine social patterns that characterize the environments of technical systems, we find certain devices and systems almost invariably linked to specific ways of organizing power of authority. And it's great that you wrote this, plenty of years ago, in 1986, and
right.
This is exactly what's happening now. And it's really amazing that, 25 years' time before this has happened, you were already speaking about this. Mm-hmm. Do you agree with what your way of thinking about these things, or have you evolved yourself about what you think between the relationship and democracy and technology?
Well, I think the important step for me, and the important step for people to think about these matters in general, is to get away from the idea that technical things, devices, systems, are simply neutral. They're just sort of out there. Some of the early examples that convinced me there was something worth studying were of sort of material systems sort of set in concrete and in place. For example, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, which was designed to essentially move people from the suburbs to downtown Oakland and San Francisco. So it's not really a democratic transportation system. The stations are set way apart. The trains travel at tremendously fast speeds. So it is a class system. It's for the upper middle class. It excludes the inner city poor. And it's a form of power and authority which was presented as a neutral and useful transit system. Now, the interesting thing, in my view, that's been happening recently is that attempts to achieve a kind of hierarchical, centralized, total system in the sphere of communication, for a variety of reasons, hasn't worked. The design of the internet, which was kind of always disaggregated, the coming of Linux, the coming of open source ideas, indeed the coming of the whole world of the net and the web and so forth, is very difficult to put into a kind of centralized, hierarchical, controlling form, although eventually that may happen. But for the time being, these questions are still very much in play. So this is how I used to focus primarily upon oppressive political artifacts. And now I'm much more interested and optimistic about liberating, democratic, communitarian political artifacts, especially in digital electronics and the internet.
So we should expect with this new technology a new forms of democracy.
Well, I would think we can expect a lot from this, but as we speak today, as you know, there's been a huge crackdown in New York City, where the Occupy Wall Street settlement, the occupation, was literally cleansed by a sweep of the police. People were arrested. The tents, everything was put in the garbage trucks and carried away, including 5,500 books in a free library that had been built there. And all of this was done under state authority, the city authority, and particularly with respect to the books. They said, we're cleaning the park for reasons of safety and sanitation, right? So if you look at books, you have to say, we've discovered important things about books. They're unclean, and they're a threat to public order, right? So when you now try to take these occupations, including the one at Puerto del Sol and throughout Spain, you sort of say, what is the reason for shutting these things down? And the reasons, if you look at them closely, are absurd. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution gives citizens the right of freedom of religion, free press, free speech, and the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. This is the first of our amendments in the Bill of Rights. But in place after place, city after city right now in the United States, the people who are expressing these rights are being jailed, their encampments are being removed. So it calls into question, the most basic questions about what kind of democracy we have. And those questions have very few answers that people in authority can give.
How do you see 15th May from outside Spain?
Oh, I see 15th of May in Spain as a great inspiration. I gave a talk at the Complutense yesterday. And one of the things that one of the participants there, Florencio Cabello, pointed out to me was that I had sent around a tweet. I think it was probably in June. And I had been here by that point to see these demonstrations in Spain and talk to many people. I had also seen general assemblies going on even late at night in the plazas, people sitting in circles and debating, right? But my tweet in the United States said, why are people, especially young people in the United States, still so passive? Why aren't they doing anything, right? And now, of course, we've had this huge movement just called Occupy Together, Occupy Wall Street, and so forth. And the connection is that many of the best ideas from Spain eventually trickled over to the United States. We know now, for example, and this is a matter of public record, the idea of these general assemblies where you have a facilitator, open consensus making, consensual methods of decision making and so forth. This was suggested to the people who were beginning to plan Occupy Wall Street by two visitors from Spain last summer. Their first names were Begonia and Luis. And they said, well, when you get this, if you get this organized, you ought to institute general assemblies. The other thing was, from Spain, was the streaming video nets, including Global Revolution and so forth, which enable people to see demonstrations around the country and around the world that are going on live in real time. And this is just the start of a number of ideas that were tried out in the 15th of May demonstrations and then came over to the United States. So it's almost as if Spain, ideas that came from Spain, have helped revitalize American democracy.
Are you optimistic?
I think I am optimistic about where things could go, but I think these are also very dangerous times. And I think today this crackdown in New York City shows how dangerous it can get. On a whim, because somebody in authority decides to sort of cleanse the park, this can happen. People can be arrested for no reason whatsoever. Libraries can be, pushed into the dump. My tweet today said, what is the difference between taking a free library of 5,500 books and putting it in the trash and the book burnings of 1930s Germany? And I think the answer to that is there's no difference whatsoever. It's an arbitrary act of power taken against something that for all of us should be almost sacred, the books we read for ideas. And I think that we could see in the United States, for example, a far right-wing backlash if you get a government that has the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court all situated on the far right, then you could see all kinds of changes in American society, which would produce a very dreary future for us all.
Mm-hmm. Are academics in the United States studying these movements?
Well, I think it's only been 2 months since we've seen Occupy Wall Street. And when the activity first started, many people dismissed this as dirty hippies doing nothing and so forth. So when I would go to the demonstrations in Albany, Occupy Albany, I always wore a coat and tie, for example, so that people wouldn't say, oh, it's just dirty hippies with strange ideas. And it took a long time for, I think, people in universities and in the media and in political life to take it seriously. And but I think as time has gone on and as the forces have grown, particularly the horizontal spread of this, more and more groups, more and more different groups in American society have begun to take part. And I think the best ideas that have come out of this occupation movement have been to reach out to people who have not been involved early on, to bring them in, to include them in the conversation. And as that happens, as this spreads, I think more and more people, including academics, are going to have to take it as a major social movement. My feeling is, as somebody who went through the movements of the 1960s, I began in Berkeley with the free speech movement, civil rights movement, anti-war movement, and so forth. My strong feeling is, and you may find this difficult to believe, this is potentially far more sweeping and powerful than any of the movements that came out of the 1960s. We will have to see what happens, where it goes. I don't think anybody can predict right now what's going to happen. But the basic kind of energy that's emerging, I think, is potentially more powerful than what we saw 45 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Sigmund Baumann was here in Madrid in Matadero, and he gave a speech where he spoke about that nowadays there were no more proletariat, but there existed this new class called precariat. Mm-hmm. Okay, the precary people, and that included 99% of the world, and that included also medium class. So it's not the marginals or the outsiders. It's mm-hmm. people from the insiders. You know? So in the end, what they are asking for is more democracy. It's not very, very strange. We could say it's not a revolution; it's a rebellion, as Andoni Alonso said mm-hmm. yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
These things that they are asking for are the same in the States that here in Spain, or we can see different kinds of things that they are asking for in Spain than in the United States.
Yeah, I don't know quite so well what people are asking for in Spain. I do know you have evictions here and foreclosures, so you have the property crisis. I do know another similarity with Spain is in the U.S. we now know that the people who are, let's say, 18 years old to 30 years old, about half of those have no jobs and no prospects of having jobs. You're seeing people's pensions wiped out as the government tries to reduce the debt and so forth. So what you see is that people who previously, I think, felt quite secure in modern industrial societies, feeling very insecure. One thing that you can point to in the United States is that we've had this idea of the American dream. The American dream was you could get a steady income, you could buy a house, you could send your children to college, and then retire with a good pension and live happily ever after. One thing that you see in the sort of kinds of groups that are getting involved in these current conversations are people who look at the American dream and say, it doesn't include me anymore. I don't have a steady income. I can't buy a house, or I lost my house. How am I going to send my children to college? And how am I ever going to retire? These are not abstract ideas. They're very real. And I know in Spain you have similar problems. You know, the future of educational institutions, the housing market, the housing bubble that burst, and so forth. So I think there are many similarities, but perhaps different ways of figuring out what to do.
What would you, under your experience and your point of view of studying technology and being some academic who has been the whole life thinking about these things, what would you tell them? Is there anything that you could counsel them to do, or to look at, or to fight for, from your point of view?
Yeah, well, maybe there are three things I would mention. There's some people who have well-established, rather rigid ideologies that they want to apply to these new energies. I think that's a bad mistake. I think people ought to go and join the demonstrations, join the occupations, join the general assemblies, and listen to what people are saying, say what they have to say, and learn from that process. Another thing that I think is really quite important is to watch very closely what's happening to the communication system. In the United States right now, we have corporate power essentially trying to shape the net in its own interest, in particular to build a kind of segmented system where people who are very wealthy send messages at a very high speed, and then everybody else gets down into, well, it used to be when you had ships at sea, the people who traveled very cheaply were said to be in steerage. And the other thing I would say is, you know, people should just move offline if that's the only place where they experience politics, which is I call clicktivism. Continue doing that. That's all very well. But they have to cross the border and to go out into the world of face-to-face political life and participate there. And I think that people will find this to be truly transformative. You will change when you go to the plaza. You will change when you go to Puerta del Sol. You will change when you go to Liberty Square in Manhattan. You will not be the same person if you spend a couple of hours or a couple of days or a couple of weeks. And I think that's a very hopeful and promising development.
Okay. Would you like to add something else, Langdon?
Well, I think one thing that I would like to emphasize is that meeting and talking with people in Spain, visiting community sites like Patio Maravillas Tabacalera, similar sites in Malaga and so forth, getting in touch with what people have to say about new philosophical notions and political notions of the commons, notions of how people might revitalize citizenship by perfecting tools to mobilize people online and bring them out into political life. These were kinds of things that for an American were new and interesting, even a hippie from Berkeley in the 60s. Many of these things were quite new. And all I can say is I'm profoundly grateful for the opportunity that was given to me to tune into these conversations, to watch these things move from apparently zero to a very fast speed later on. And I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity.
Well, it has been a very, very marvelous pleasure to have you inside the kitchen, as we say in Spain. And what it's really marvelous is to know someone who has been so, we could say, so cute, so and also so sharp-minded, that has been inside all the kitchens, because you have met most of the people, the most important people that have been in this movement, and that's something that only someone with some kind of good sense could be able to do. No, no one else has done it. You know, so it's quite a pleasure to have met you in all these kitchens, we could say, and to listen from your voice. That has been also very, very important for people in Spain, because in the end it's not the same to be by our own, that to know that we are with some people who are in the job of thinking about how to make better democracy and a better world. So thank you very much to you, Langdon.
Well, thank you.
Well, hello, Langdon. Just before the 15th May in Spain, I know that you were here studying.
To me and said, "Oh, I think we understand some of the chemistry that's going on, how those various forces could bring tens of thousands of people into the plazas in Spain."
So now you are assisting to what's happening also in the United States.
Yes.
Occupy Wall Street.
Yes.
Do you figure to be some differences, or do they happen to be any difference or any similarities between what's happening in Spain and what's happening in the United States?
Well, I think they're both similarities and differences. I think some of the similarities are sociological and economic. You have major and Twitter and so forth. And in that case, what you saw in early 2011 was dictatorships beginning to crumble and so forth. And in these talks that I gave, I said, well, who knows if this is going to spread or not. Most of the people that listened to this found it entertaining, but they maybe always find me a little crazy and entertaining. So they said, "That's very nice, Langdon, but don't worry." And particularly in the United States, they would say, "It can't happen here. People are so apathetic. They just watch TV, and that's that. And that's that." Then when the May 15th event started happening, colleagues came up.
The situation of doing certain studies where you met plenty of people here in Madrid, and then you went back to the United States when this happened. Now, what did you see in Madrid?
Well, when I went back to the United States, I just talked about meeting people from Media Lab Prado, philosophers at Complutense who were interested in notions of open source, free software, the commons, ideas like that. I talked to some journalists. I talked to some activists, particularly the hacktivistas at Tabacalera and Patio de Maravillas. I went back to the United States, and this was late 2010, early 2011, and just began giving talks about what I had seen there and all of the interesting things that seemed to be a kind of almost like a volcano before it blows. And so I talked to student audiences and my faculty about this, and I said, "Watch Spain, something is happening there." And then Tahrir Square came along, where you saw the plaza fill up, the relationship between people's face-to-face politics there, and the offline activities such as Facebook, LinkedIn,